Welcome. My name is Leslie Thompson. I am a settler and guest on the lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. And tonight I am joining y'all in my role as Director of Adult Programs here at the Sid Richardson Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us for our lecture program. If you haven't been to the museum recently, we have a new exhibition on display titled Remington and Russell in Black and White. And it features some of the artists' grayscale works done for the purpose of illustrations to accompany stories for publication. And in particular, Remington, he really gained popularity by readers of journals like Harper's and Collier's with his illustrations seen by tens of thousands of readers of these magazines. So I feel like one could argue that the U.S. Postal Service really deserves some credit for Remington's fame. Now tonight, for this two-part lecture, we are going to explore the development and impact of the U.S. Post on the expansion of the American West and its many residents. The first part of this talk, we're going to look at a period when millions of settlers were moving into the Western United States between roughly the 1860s to the early 1900s. And it was during this time that they relied on a continent-spanning communications network to really help connect them to the wider world. And that was, of course, the U.S. Post. So in the first part of this paired lecture program, Dr. Cameron Blevins will map the spread of the U.S. Post using a data set of more than 100,000 post offices, revealing how unassuming federal infrastructure helped weave together the colonialization of the American West. Then we will move into part two of the talk, in which Dr. Justin Gage will explore how Native Americans skillfully used the U.S. Post to spread information and advocate for their rights. In the last quarter of the 19th century, Native Americans wrote letters to communicate across reservation boundaries, and massive networks of correspondence tied Native Americans together. So it was through the use of the U.S. Post that Native Americans were able to forge intertribal bonds while spreading valuable knowledge and corresponding with white Americans to help push for justice and self-determination. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I want to point out to our audience out there on Zoom that there is a Q&A box here tonight on our Zoom platform for those who are joining us live. So if at any point you have a question during either presentation, I'm going to ask you to please type your questions into that Q&A box so that we can collect them all in one place. And then at the very end, after both talks, we will hold a joint Q&A session with both speakers. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Cameron Blevins is Associate Professor, Clinical Teaching Track at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he teaches courses on U.S. history and digital humanities, while serving as the Director of Digital Initiatives for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He is the author of Paper Trails, the U.S. Post and the Making of the American West, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, for which he was awarded the 2022 Smithsonian National Poster Museum's Book Prize. And he is currently collaborating on an effort to map queer spaces in the United States during the late 20th century. Cameron also co-leads two public humanities projects. The first, Data Advocacy for All, is building on an open access curriculum for teaching students how to deploy data for socially engaged causes. And then the second project that he's working on, Recovering Aurora's Past, examines the historical legacy of displacement and removal of a largely Chicano neighborhood that gave rise to Denver's Aurora campus. And we are delighted to have him with us tonight. So with that, Cameron, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited, and thank you all online here. I know it's a Friday evening, so hopefully we can provide a little bit of entertainment. So, as Leslie said, I'm going to be laying out the first half of this kind of paired lecture here, where you can think of this as the big picture, the 64,000-foot view of the U.S. Post in the Western United States. And at that point, I'll kind of pass the baton over to Justin to talk about the second half, which is really delving into native networks in particular. And I wish I could be there in person because I was looking at it. Seems like a really wonderful institution there in Texas. So thank you. So I'll get started here. And I want to begin by addressing the elephant in the room, which is that if you look at the title of this talk, and in particular, the U.S. Post and the American West, I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of folks are going to immediately think of one thing in particular, and that is the Pony Express. And I was looking through the Sid Richardson Museum's online collections, and in fact, I found a painting that is held by the museum that is titled Trouble on the Pony Express. This is by the artist Frank Tenney Johnson. And again, it's held by the Sid Richardson Museum. And this museum is not alone. I think if you look at many kind of collections of Western Americana, whether that's paintings, other types of art, sculptures, etc., you will find the Pony Express everywhere, right? So the National Postal Museum, perhaps unsurprisingly, has one. And then Frederick Remington, which I understand you all have an exhibit going on right now, also has a painting about the Pony Express, the coming and going of the Pony Express here. And I think this is pretty indicative of the real hold that the Pony Express has on the American imagination. I like to call it one of the most successful marketing campaigns in American history. And the reason why I say this is because the kind of memory and hold that it has on America versus its historical significance is totally out of whack. So the Pony Express only operated for about a year and a half. It was this private company. It carried very few pieces of mail comparatively. And over those 18 months, it also lost a ton of money. And so when you write a book like I have about, again, the Postal Service in the American West, everyone wants to know about the Pony Express. And I want to start there because I think it's a useful entry point into this larger topic to compare the Pony Express to the larger network of the U.S. Post that I'm going to be talking about today. So the U.S. Post was the world's largest communications network in the 1800s by orders of magnitude. It was far larger than any other national system of mail. And I'm going to get into trying to kind of compare that and look at that in more detail later. But to try to wrap our heads around what this giant network was, how it operated, and most importantly, what it meant, I'm actually going to zoom down to a much smaller scale to start with. And I want to take us to a particular place in the American West. This is the backcountry of central Arizona, the Salt River Valley. And I want us to go back to September of 1886. I want to look at two individual people, Benjamin and Mary Curtis. These are two newlyweds who were living in Arizona in 1886. And their story, in a lot of ways, is emblematic of this time period and the region as a whole. Benjamin was born in Ohio in 1847. He was the youngest of four siblings. Unfortunately for them, they were orphaned at a young age. Both their parents passed away when Benjamin was quite young. He would go on to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War before making his way westward as a young man after the war. Worked on a railway line in Nebraska. He was a clerk in California, a farmer in San Diego, before finally relocating to Arizona Territory in 1884 to try his hand at ranching. Again, this kind of classic itinerant American West story. And it was in Arizona in the backcountry while he was trying to start this ranch that he met Mary Hawker. This is the daughter of a neighboring ranching family. She was born in Kansas in 1865 and spent most of her life in Colorado before her family moved south to Arizona for her father's health. There she met Benjamin. The two of them had a brief, very brief courtship before getting married in 1885. Which brings us to the following year. 1 year later, on September 8th, 1886, Benjamin sat down at a table in the baking hot Arizona sun to write a letter to his two older sisters, Delia and Henrietta Curtis. And he was writing to share some important news. In particular, he wanted to tell them about the birth of a baby daughter 3 days before, telling them that, quote, your little niece is sleeping nicely and the mother is doing well also. Last Sunday morning at 1:30 a.m., we were made happy by its successful arrival. And he went on to share how Mary was doing. It's a trying time for any mother, but Mary stood it bravely. And although it was 100 degrees here now in this room, she does not complain, but is just as sweet as ever. And then in one of my favorite parts of the letter, he goes on to say, we think it's just the nicest baby ever born. Only it doesn't take after his father because it has plenty of hair on the top of his head. This kind of self-deprecating joke about his own early baldness. But then he gets to the meat of the letter itself, the real meaning there. Sharing with his two sisters what they decided to name the child. Mary says she thinks Delia Henrietta would do nicely, and so do I. Telling his two sisters, again, orphaned children, telling these two sisters that he is naming their baby daughter after them, extending these lines of family into the next generation. This letter is part of a larger collection that's held at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, and it includes dozens of letters that were exchanged between Benjamin and his siblings over the course of several decades, from when they were orphaned in the 1840s all the way to Benjamin's death in 1892. And when I was reading all these letters in this particular collection, what was interesting was that the Curtis siblings kept mentioning all this other stuff that's traveling between them. Not just letters, but a larger constellation of material that's passing through the mail. So he mentioned at various points how he and Mary subscribed to about half a dozen newspapers and periodicals. So this included things like a magazine, The American Agriculturalist for Benjamin, this is a farming and ranching periodical, or a women's magazine called The Delineator for Mary. And this carried short stories, sewing and embroidery patterns, and home decor advice. And then not one, not two, but 4 different newspapers from across the country. So this included a newspaper from Chicago, San Francisco, New York, and then a nearby Arizona city named Globe. And this is really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the different kinds of information that was moving through the mail from Benjamin and Mary's ranch in Arizona to his sisters in California. I'll give you a couple examples that they mention in their letters. He asked his sisters to send fiction, but good, send by mail, which I enjoy. A photograph of their dead parents, a silk kerchief, other kinds of materials, money, a breastpin for Mary to wear at their wedding, other kind of clothing and material, and then finally a bundle of San Diego newspapers to kind of understand what's happening in that city. And so this kinds of stuff, this kind of material here, right? All of these are what we can think of as the paper trails of the past, right? The stuff that gets left behind. And we historians, Justin and I and others, you know, we spend a lot of our time looking at this kind of stuff as sources of information. But I think we're not often quite as good at recognizing how these particular paper trails were generated. So understanding this kind of straightforward fact that each and every letter had to travel from point A to point B. And without this journey, without this paper physically moving from Benjamin's table in the Salt River Valley to his sister's letterbox in San Diego, scraps of paper are just that, scraps of paper. The meaning behind them is really dependent on their ability to travel across really large distances. And those distances were quite big. To zoom out for a second, again, Benjamin is living in the Salt River Valley in Arizona. This is really rugged Western backcountry. When he first moved there about 2 years ago, he was a bachelor trying to start a ranch, and he complained that he had nothing but his cows and his horses for company. It was a 60-mile round trip to the nearest doctor, and he was basically alone, totally isolated. Except, as we've seen, he wasn't. He was able to use the mail to stay really shockingly connected to the wider world, right? So using the mail, for instance, to write, and again, and tell his sisters about the birth of his daughter. Now, he wrote this letter on September 8th. 3 days later, on September 11th, he walked out the front steps of his house and then walked 15 minutes to the nearest post office called Catalpa, less than 1 mile away from his home. Dropped it off on September 11th. 4 days later, on September 15th, it arrived at his sister's letterbox in the San Diego post office. 4 days to go from the middle of nowhere in the Arizona backcountry across 400 miles of mesa and scrubland, deserts and mountains, and end up in the hands of his sister. The ability of Benjamin to access this network, right? To walk out his front door and 15 minutes later be at a post office was all because this was part of a much larger system, this vast network of mail routes and post offices that wove together the largest postal system in the world, and arguably the most expansive communications network on the planet at the time, the US Post. And at this point, I want to move from this kind of individual experience to try to understand the larger significance of how Benjamin and Mary's story, their ability to access this network, how it fit within the larger system itself. So if we go forward a couple of years, in 1889, in an annual report, the Postmaster General reported that there were about 59,000 post offices operating across the country, and 670,000 kilometers of mail routes. And if we compare this on an international level, you start to see rapidly that the US Post was a global outlier on the world stage, operating several orders of magnitude more post offices and mail routes than any other country on Earth. So this was a really, really large infrastructure in a global kind of context. But what does 59,000 post offices mean? Well, here's a map of what 58,999 post offices operating in the year 1889 looks like. This is the geography of the world's most expansive communications network. And I'm going to come back to this map in a second here, but I first want to take a brief detour and talk about how I made this particular map. This is a project of digital history. Basic idea is using computers and technology for how to research, teach, or communicate about the past. And in my case, I was really interested in trying to map out what this network actually looked like. But to do so, I relied on the work and labor of a man named Richard Hellbach, who unfortunately passed away before I got the chance to meet him. But this was a historian, genealogist, and stamp collector who spent decades collecting information about trying to get information about every post office that ever operated in the United States, eventually compiling information about around 166,000 post offices. And so to do that, it was this kind of laborious process. He would go and look at archive microfilm. This is from the National Archives, and transcribing all of this kind of handwritten microfilm into a database of some kind, right? So the name of the post office, the state and county where it operated, and the years it was in operation. I was able to get this database that Richard Hellbach created, and then further kind of turn that into mappable data. I'm not going to go into the details of necessarily how I did this, but I want to kind of show behind and open up the hood a little bit and take a look at just to kind of how we got to this point. So this is a map of what 166,000 post offices looks like from Richard Hellbach's contributions there. It allows us to kind of zoom in on a particular year, right? What does 58,999 post offices operating in 1889 actually mean? And doing that allows us to start to place the story of Benjamin and Mary Curtis into this larger context. Their ability to subscribe to half a dozen different newspapers, send things back and forth to San Diego to family members. All of this is contingent, again, on being to access this really continental spanning network. And I think it's really important to pause here and think about this, because Benjamin and Mary are living in the Salt River Valley, very, very isolated geographically, but able to access this network. But if they had moved there 10, 15 years earlier, they would not have been able to access this network. The connectivity that they had in the 1880s didn't exist for them a decade earlier in that particular part of the West, because this wasn't just kind of a static network. This is one that grew and expanded and changed very rapidly. And I want to show you just kind of what I mean by that here. This is an animation going year by year of the expansion of the US Post across the North American West here. You're seeing it start on this kind of narrow strip on the Atlantic seaboard before further pushing out west. And during the 1840s into the 1850s, it starts to seize all this Western land, and the postal network kind of follows in step until you get to 1889, where it's filled in the Western interior to some degree. And I'll talk about some of the exceptions in a second here. This, I think, is some of the power of digital history, of being able to take what can be a really huge entity like the US Post, right? Tens of thousands of post offices, and try to wrap our heads around what did that look like and what's the story that we can kind of tell with it. And as part of that, I also built a kind of accompanying website to the book called gossamernetwork.com. And I want to just raise, let's see if I can do this real quick. There we go. Okay, hopefully folks can still see that. And so when I was thinking about writing the book, you face some challenges, right? With a printed book, you can't have these kind of animated maps. You can't click on things. It's not interactive. And so what I ended up doing with a couple other talented folks was trying to build a website that allowed you to take in this really big picture change of how the network, the postal network, spread and operated in the Western United States. And it goes in this kind of chronological order, chapter by chapter. And starting in the 1848 with the discovery of gold, the conquest of incorporation of formerly a territory that belonged to Mexico. And you can see in particular these kind of forays into the Western United States that up until that point was still controlled in large part by Native people, which I'll get back to in just a second. But you can go through this chapter by chapter and start to understand how a lot of this growth is moving hand in hand with other kinds of growth. I just want to go forward a second here. So you can see something, for instance, like the growth of the transcontinental railroad across the middle of the Western United States, and seeing all of these post offices kind of cropping up alongside it, right? And the ways in which the post interacted with things like mining booms and busts, infrastructure growth, ranching, etc. But in particular, I want to look at one process to try to set up Justin's half of the talk here. And that is in particular looking at the process of settler colonial expansion in the Western United States. So in my book, I make the case that the US Post was absolutely crucial for a larger process of settler colonialism during the second half of the 1800s. And settler colonialism is basically the forced removal of one population and its replacement by an occupying population. And this is exactly what happened in the Western United States. And in some cases, the maps that I've shown to this point can be a little bit misleading because post offices were not filling in some empty continent. In fact, the American West was very much not empty at the time. It was still occupied by Native people. And the Western United States and the history behind it has kind of shifted over time. But there's been a lot of work recently looking at this kind of history of settler colonialism, the forced removal of Native American people in the West, the replacement and occupation by largely white settlers kind of moving westward. And this story and a lot of the scholarship around it tends to focus on what us academics would term state power. And this is basically the power ability of the federal government to enable this process of removal and occupation. And when we think about the idea of state power, a lot of times we rightfully think about the ability of, say, the US military, for instance, to wage war against Western tribes, forcibly take them off their land and force them onto a system of reservations. But what I was really interested in was less this kind of more obvious and violent form of state power, but instead looking at the role of something like the US Post in facilitating this process of settler colonial expansion. And so this map is showing you in blue the post offices that were operating in 1865, so right at the end of the Civil War. And then in light gray is unceded native land. So this was areas of the West that were still very much occupied and controlled by native groups, often quite powerful native groups. So the Lakota, for instance, Lakota in the Northern Plains here, the Comanche in West Texas, the Apaches in Arizona, which is where Benjamin would eventually end up 2 decades later. All of these groups were actively blocking the expansion of both American settlers like Benjamin and Mary Curtis, but also the expansion of the US Post. And then in dark gray here, you can see the growth of this kind of system of government reservations, where the US government would eventually force indigenous people off their land and onto these contained areas. And if you overlay post offices onto this map of native land, you can see how these two things went hand in hand. So as the US is again kind of forcibly taking land from native people, what you see is the US Post immediately occupying that land rapidly on its heels. So anytime the kind of the federal government is able to cleave off pieces of land from native groups, the US Post pops up almost immediately. If we zoom in a little bit right here, so I teach and live in Colorado, you can see this quite clearly. So in 1870, this is the post offices that existed in Colorado in 1870 here. And basically the western third of Colorado was very much still controlled and occupied by an allied group of Ute people. But that changed in 1873 when federal officials renegotiated with several Ute leaders and reached the so-called Bruno Agreement. And this ceded an additional chunk of land in southwestern Colorado, where they had discovered kind of this rich mineral deposits in the San Juan Mountains. Congress officially ratified that agreement in 1874 and opened up 3.7 million acres to white settlers. And the US Post moved in immediately. So to see the expansion here, by 1875, you see all these dozens of post offices popping up in southwestern Colorado. Again, some of the most remote and difficult to reach places in the country. This very mountainous terrain, the infrastructure is quite sparse, but even then the US Post is able to start operating an infrastructure there. And all of this kind of allowed a larger process of settler colonialism. If we think back to Benjamin and Mary Curtis by the 1880s, their ability to interact with and stay connected to the wider world, to send letters, subscribe to newspapers and magazines, send money through the mail, all of that, of course, hinged on having this ready access to the US Post, the ability to step outside their front door and walk less than a mile away to a post office, pick up mail, to send stuff that would get to Southern California a couple days later. None of this kind of would have been possible without the ability and the underlying infrastructure of the US Post. But this, of course, was not the case for everyone living in the West. If you look at this map, I'm guessing some of you might be wondering, what is this thing going on here in the middle, right? This kind of weird space where it just looks like a little hole has been cut in an otherwise quite dense network of post offices? And the answer, of course, is Indian Territory. This is where, by 1889, the federal government had forcibly moved many, many groups of Native people onto. And as you can see, the the federal government's willingness to extend that very dense postal infrastructure basically ran right up against the borders of Indian Territory and then withered away. Very minimal federal infrastructure existed within Indian Territory. But as we're about to find out, that did not mean that people living in these spaces were not able to still access and use the mail for their own devices. So at that point, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and pass the baton over to Justin.
All right. Thank you, Cameron. That was fascinating. So before we move into Justin's presentation, I just again want to remind people that if you have questions about Cameron's part of the talk, please go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A box as we move forward, and we will get to those questions at the very end. But I next want to move into the second part of this lecture program by exploring native networks created through the U.S. Post with Dr. Gage. And Justin Gage is a historian of the American West who studies Native American mobility and anti-colonial activism in the early reservation years. He received his PhD from the University of Arkansas in 2015, and then before returning to the University of Arkansas as an assistant professor in 2023, Dr. Gage was an assistant professor at the University of Florida and a visiting researcher at the University of Helsinki. Justin's first book, We Do Not Want the Gates Closed Between Us, Native Networks and the Spread of the Ghost Dance, was awarded the 2021 Outstanding Western Book by the Center for the Study of the American West and the Beatrice Medicine Award from the Association for the Study of American Indian Literatures. And just last month, he was awarded the 2024 Smithsonian National Postal Museum's Book Prize. So we have two book prize winners with us this evening. And his research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Western History Association, the American Philosophical Society, among many others. And we are delighted to continue this journey through the history of the U.S. Post with Dr. Gage tonight. So with that, Justin, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for inviting me. Good to be with you, Cameron. I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Washington, D.C., where I've been doing the things historians do, researching at the National Archives for a few weeks. But yesterday I went to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, which is fantastic for those of you who want to learn more about what we're talking about at a museum. So stop by that place. It's right by Union Station in DC. So again, I thank you. Cameron set things up very nicely for me. I actually went back and erased some slides that now I don't have to discuss because it was such a great presentation. So I'm going to focus on Native Americans, the history of Native Americans in the late 19th century, so 1870s, 1880s, into the 1890s. And of course, I just want to remind folks that Native Americans are very much still a part of our nation, a part of this continent's history. There are over 9 million people of Native American descent living in the United States, and incredibly, Native nations are diverse. There are 574 sovereign tribal nations in the United States currently, and the diversity of the West during the period that Cameron and I are discussing, the diversity was just incredible. These nations were different. They were distinct. They had their own ways of living, their ways of knowing, their own societies, their cultures, their languages. Incredibly diverse people who were different from one from another. And they before the reservation era, they intermingled, they interacted, they communicated. Unfortunately, during this process of U.S. settler colonialism, the expansion of the American population into the West, Native Americans were forced, after years of resistance, forced onto these reservations, these ever shrinking pieces of land that were created by the U.S. government to relocate Native Americans, to contain them in spaces and separate them from one another. They were meant to not interact. They were meant to largely be separate. So again, Cameron's animations were fantastic. But this process of conquering the West, it really picks up steam during and just after the American Civil War in the 1860s. So the early reservation era, I call it that as a way to remind us that the reservation era is a very long period, that those early years were the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And this isn't all the reservations in the West. This is some of the larger ones, and the ones I focus on. Now, in order to force Native Americans onto these reservations, of course, it required a lot of violence. It required the threat of violence. And there were many series of what we call Indian wars. It's label that's typically given to them. Many more than what's on this map. By the 1880s, most all Native Americans in the West were on reservations. Not all, but most all. And on reservations, Native Americans they're a colonized people. They're living on reservations under U.S. government control. And the U.S. government hoped keeping Native Americans on reservations would keep them away from each other and keep them away from the white populations that were, coursing through the plains that you saw very clearly on Cameron's maps. The Office of Indian Affairs, it was created by the U.S. government to control the Native populations. So you have agents, special agents, sub-agents, assistant farmers, clerks, and teachers, and other government employees who were hired to manage thousands of Native Americans living on these reservations. Now, as remote as those reservations seemed to white Americans, Native Americans were not disconnected from the outside world. So despite all this colonial control and confinement, Native Americans maintain a life of mobility in the late 19th century. This tenacious mobility, which I define not only as the freedom of geographic movement, but also the ability to express their ideas widely. This mobility allowed Western Native Americans to create these vast networks of communication that crossed boundaries of those reservations. So in my first book, my only book at this point, I'm working on a second one. In my book, I look at these two ways that Native Americans threaded together intertribal networks. So in the 1870s, 1880s, tribes visited each other. They often left reservations without permission. So at this moment, in this period, Native Americans required permission to leave reservations. The surveillance to keep them on reservations. The U.S. Army would be called out if they left reservations without permission. But despite the threat of punishment, many people left without permission to go visit other reservations and visit other Native peoples. So they would visit to facilitate social ties, even trade, disseminating important ideas. And also I write about the letter writing and using the postal system to, they begin using the postal system, which is clearly a great tool of U.S. colonialism. They use that postal system to their own benefit. They use it to in many ways, oppose colonialism. And they spread ideas that were in opposition to the ideas of the U.S. government. They would spread things, particularly like things like religious ideas, religious knowledge, things like the ghost stance, which white Americans thought was uncivilized and backward. So these letters, written by Native men, women, children, it bridged the distances between reservations. And this could happen largely outside of the control of Indian affairs, of colonialism. So individuals could remain tied to their families, families to their tribes, and tribes to other tribes throughout the West. So in my book, I look at these networks. This is a map of those visits I mentioned, which I won't spend any time talking about today. So, all of this connectivity, it posed problems for the U.S. government. Native Americans were able to express their thoughts and beliefs outside of control. This map I've been working on continuously for quite a while. This map represents over 3,000 letters that I've found written by or for Native Americans in this period. I'm always adding to it. I've already found a couple hundred the past couple weeks at the National Archives, and so hopefully this map demonstrates to you that the extensive networks that were being built through the post. Mostly these letters represent postal deliveries as well. Now, of course, Native Americans began using letters because they were becoming more literate. In the 1880s, because of the U.S. government's suppressive education system, Native Americans, more and more Native Americans began to adopt literacy, and they began using that literacy for their own purposes rather than transforming themselves into white people. They were using literacy to maintain their identity, to maintain their ways of life. Now, so let me just say a few words about education in this period. Education was at the core of the Indian Affairs strategy to Americanize Native populations of the West. Millions of dollars is spent by the federal government during the 1880s, to teach Indians how to read and write. And education was supposed to make Native Americans think and act like white people. It was supposed to, discourage indigenous ways of life, discourage anti-colonial ideas, not really play a part in their success. So, to acquire the skills of reading and writing in English or even in their own native languages, many Western Native Americans sent their children to schools. But of course, many others were coerced or threatened into sending their children to school. And as time went on, more and more children were forced to go to school, and they became places of terrible mental and even physical abuse. And this abuse was used as a way to eradicate Native ways of life from students, and government policies were dedicated to that end. So, these colonial strategies to kill the Indian in him and save the man, that famous phrase from the Carlisle superintendent, that strategy to completely change Native Americans, it wasn't successful. Natives knew that this education and English literacy was meant to be a tool that would contribute to the destruction of their cultures, but they use it as a tool of self-determination instead. So more and more people learn how to read and write in English in their own native languages. And again, this is happening during the growth of the expansion of the U.S. Postal Service. And as you could maybe see on Cameron's map pretty clearly, at least I did, there were reservations that had all reservations had at least one post office, at least it seemed to me. Depending on the year, depending on the location, some reservations had many post offices, or several at least. And these post offices become, the hubs of tribal communication. Native Americans were at post offices all the time on reservations. And Native Americans saw that the mail offered practical benefits. And as more and more Native Americans began, learning to read and write, the usefulness of literacy became more apparent. The usefulness of the post became more apparent. And it was quite useful, I argue. You know, one immediate reason Native Americans, especially those of an older generation, began using literacy, using the post, was to keep in touch with their children who were, you know, often sent off to boarding schools, either really far away across the continent or at boarding schools, you know, in close proximity on the reservation. And so parents and children wrote back and forth. You also have tribes who had, you know, really no relationship with another tribe. There were tribes that forged new bonds with distant tribes through letters. There were tribes that had a history of conflict that used letters to make peace. There were a lot of tribes that were separated by geography and you know the consequences of colonialism. Tribes that were meant to be separate, or tribes of the same people of the same tribes being divided by government plans, and they could use letters to stay in constant contact, learn about the affairs of other groups. One example of this were the Southern Utes down in Southwest Colorado, you can see on the map, and Northern Utes up in the Uinta Inouye reservation in Utah. And I found between 1881 and 1893 that at least 60 letters were exchanged between those groups. Letters that you know, diverse range of topics, information, news, ideas, philosophies. So these are distinct groups of people, Northern and Southern Utes, but they shared relatives, they shared friendships, they shared culture, and they were separated by the government on two different reservations, and they weren't meant to travel back and forth, at least not without permission. So they wrote. So the letters carried news, and they carried information, they carried well wishes. At least 24 letters from the Northern Utes to the Southern Utes, you know, relayed bad news, I found. In November of 1890, the Northern Utes reported numerous deaths, unfortunately. One letter said, "We will inform you all deaths that may happen here at any time in the future. All my brothers and sisters have died and left me all alone, and I will have to die sometime. Can't help all from dying sometime. The doctor can't help people from dying sometime. All die, large, small, old, and young." So, you know, unfortunately, this was a way of life dealing with suffering on reservations, and these letters gave tribes an ability to grieve collectively, you know, after periods of disease, death, even starvation. There's also tribes, you know, writing to exchange advice, exchange strategies in managing their changing worlds. Correspondence was used by leaders to spread influence, to sway minds, to hash out disagreements. A lot of people use letters, you know, to inform others about the dirty dealings of the U.S. government. So tribes passed along information, you know, about surviving diseases. There are letters that were about, you know, warning other tribes about outbreaks of smallpox, recommendations to take vaccines. This is a letter that was actually published in the 19th century by a missionary. A letter written by Mantuku Namba in Omaha. He wrote to a Yankton named Feather in the Ear, pictured there. He wrote to warn the Yanktons of an outbreak of smallpox that was spreading south among the Omahas. And he wrote, you know, ask for medicine among the white people. If you are vaccinated, you don't have the smallpox. And so, you know, smallpox had devastated the Omaha and Poncas both in 1878, unfortunately. And so, you know, by the mid 1880s, you have all this intertribal correspondence, and it's being used regularly by Native Americans, by leaders, and especially as a political tool, this anti-colonial weapon. This is the home of the Oglala Lakota leader, Red Cloud. This is in 1890. This is a picture of his house. If you zoom in there, you can see on the shelf this stack of a couple books. It looks like notebook, letters, paper, ink. Now Red Cloud was illiterate. He was an older man. He also had bad eyes in these years, but despite this, he's very effective at using correspondence to empower his people. And so these intertribal letters were used to, collectively discuss and organize protests against government policies to combat land loss. For example, in 1886, many nations, including Lakotas, were debating the merits of the Dawes Act, the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Bill, was disastrous plan of individual allotments of land. It was passed by Congress in late 1887, dramatically hastened land loss for most tribes in the West. And Lakota activists used letters to generate opposition against it. And that's pretty successful initially amongst Lakota. One letter from an agent wrote or read, many letters from Indians of the other Sioux agencies have been received by them, importuning them to join this movement against the Dawes Act. Now, this type of activism was not good news for the U.S. government, and so it actually tries to suppress Native correspondence. It actually tries to suppress the Post because of these anti-colonial notions that are spread along these Native networks. Officials were really afraid on its impact to their efforts to assimilate. So the only goes, of course, once you have Native Americans on reservations, you're trying to change them there. You're trying to convince them through persuasion or coercion that there's this better path, this civilized path. And if Native Americans are fighting against that, it doesn't help Indian Affairs' mission. And so U.S. officials believe that these dangerous influences, that some of these ideas spread through intertribal networks, it might weaken the reservation system. So there are these categories of knowledge that are being spread, I found, through letters. And white folks are especially worried about these categories. First, tribal nations, they could share their experiences dealing with the U.S. government, right? They all have their own dealings with the government. They could tell others what happened to them and how they did what they did and their successes or their failures. And so they could devise strategies together to resist government control. So these exchanges gave Native Americans this advantageous knowledge as they negotiated government demands. And that's really frustrating for a lot of officials. Second, indigenous religious ideas and practices were spread and reinforced, even as the U.S. government is trying to attack those beliefs, trying to stop them. They're still being, propagated. Third, letters allowed Native peoples to, express their opinions on government policies, to criticize them, to push for sovereignty, to seek justice, to make injustice known to white allies, to tell, the American public about the injustices being done to them. And so if all these opinions and ideas being circulated were seen to be damaging to the U.S. government's civilizing efforts, an agent like this guy here at the Kiowa Comanche Reservation in Indian Territory, these agents could make life difficult for letter writers. And some letter writers were worried about retribution from their agents. And there are instances I found where these U.S. Indian agents are surveilling and even censoring the mail coming in and going out of the reservations. This forced at least one group of Lakota at Standing Rock to leave their reservation in the dead of night, cross the Missouri River to mail letters at the nearest white town, because they couldn't do it on the reservation. This is that letter from a group of Standing Rock folks that the Standing Rock agent was trying to prevent, the Secretary of the Interior from seeing. The Native Americans, the Lakotas, They thought that if they mailed this at Standing Rock, it would never reach Washington, D.C. So they went to the next white town over. They wrote, "To send you these few lines, we had to run the risk of being imprisoned. They are afraid that if the world would know the truth, justice would be done." So, hundreds of Western Native Americans use the written word as this sort of tool, this tool of anti-colonial activism in the 1870s, 1880s. And an incredible number of letters made their way from Western reservations into the hands of non-Native people, to white people. So they're sending letters to, U.S. officials in the East, to presidents, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, congressmen, but they're also sending to newspapers, newspaper editors, businessmen, reformers, allies. So I've cataloged, a bunch of those letters. This map represents 2,500 Native letters to non-Native Americans. And of course, these are the easiest to find in the archives because they're being archived. The material is often being preserved by the U.S. government or by wealthy folks in the East. And so I'm able to find a lot of these letters in archives. And so in these letters, Native Americans, criticize policies and employees of the government. They're demanding that treaty promises be kept. They're making their opinions known about Indian affairs decisions. So they're really criticizing the arbitrary power of the U.S. government, the power to limit their basic freedoms. They're also writing to defend, parts of their culture, defend their religion, their dancing, their social norms. So this is the topic of my next book. The networks built with white folks to an effort of activism. Now, before I end, and I could go on for much longer about this guy here. We still have half an hour remaining, I suppose. So we'll see. This man here, a single letter writer, Wolf Chief. He's in Hidatsa from the Fort Berthold Reservation. This photo is from 1879. He's probably around 30 years old here. He began writing letters to U.S. officials and other powerful white people in 1880. And he does this when he's not yet fluent in English. And he continued to write letters until his death in 1933. So I'll share a little bit of his history today to give you the sense of how Native letter writers made a difference in their lives in the 1880s. The many issues that Wolf Chief describes in his letters, the demands he made, the help he wanted, they're not unusual. There are hundreds of other Native Americans writing similar letters at the same time as Wolf Chief. But Wolf Chief is extraordinary because of all the letter writers I've found, he sent an astonishing amount of letters, even when he's not getting replies. I found over 100 of his letters written between 1880 and 1891 alone. And so not many Western natives were that prolific or that persistent, especially those who weren't considered to be leaders in their own communities. As the first Fort Berthold agent who had to deal with Wolf Chief letters, as he put it, he said Wolf Chief was, quote, somewhat given to complaints. 20 years after that, another agent, Fort Berthold agent, told the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that Wolf Chief had contracted the letter writing habit and cannot be suppressed. So, he really incredibly, he starts going to the day school at the agency, at the reservation, when he's probably in his late 20s. So he's a grown man when he begins trying to learn English and how to write and read in English. This is where Fort Berthold is and still is today. This is the reservation of the Dotson, the Mandan, and the Rickera. So, let me think out how I want to move this along. I want to keep plenty of time for questions. Um, you know, one reason he started writing letters to DC is because he was really astonished. His first letter, he sent, him and a few friends, they wanted to visit Washington DC so they could talk, face to face with really the president of the United States. And he wrote a letter, to the president. He was telling the president what was happening at Fort Berthold. He's asking if they can go to DC. He's telling the president that the buffaloes are gone, the bison have all disappeared, that they need more rations. And eventually, Wolf Chief's letter was answered. His first letter was actually answered, and he realized that he could communicate directly with the central power. He didn't have to go through his agent. He didn't have to go through, the sub agent. He could talk directly to the president. And so that really spurred his efforts on. His agent, one of his agents said, Wolf Chief is a good worker, making some progress in studies, and he was really elated over his ability to write. But now that he is being able to, to write, the agent says he's got this egotism about being able to write to what some Native Americans call the president, the Great Father. But Wolf Chief, what this really means is Wolf Chief could represent his people, and he could hope to compel the U.S. government to live up to its obligations, to really limit the government involvement in their daily life. And so, Wolf Chief, like a lot of other Native Americans, knew that their lives were controlled by treaties and laws and regulations and policies. And all this stuff was recorded on paper, written in the only language that white Americans cared about. They were written in English. Also, these letters gave folks, here's 450 letters to DC alone. They gave people this path to that place. Wolf Chief also, wrote, well, there's so many things he wrote about. One interesting thing he wrote about early on was he was concerned about these steamboats going up the Missouri River, up and down, and stealing the cordwood that Mandans and Hidatsis had been stacking on the banks. They're cutting trees, and they were going to sell wood, and these ships would just steal it. And he pursued this issue for a long time in correspondence, trying to stop it. And so, like Wolf Chief, many other Native Americans sent letters to U.S. officials to report land violators, report trespassers, settlers who are legally using Indian lands to graze cattle, to harvest wood, all sorts of things. They wrote to report agents who are using, resources, grazing lands to line their own pockets. And so, Wolf Chief, he didn't just write letters to the president or to the commissioner of Indian Affairs. He wrote, to any white person he thought might be influential. He wrote to an acquaintance in Bismarck, that this steamboat, the owner of the steamboat, was stealing wood from him. He wrote letters to another businessman in Bismarck. One of these letters was published in the Bismarck Tribune under the really derogatory headline, "He Write Good." And Wolf Chief, after this, began writing directly to the publisher of the Bismarck Tribune. And of course, he wants his letters to be published in the paper. He would write in the paper about how the steamboatmen were taking wood. He would also write to advertise his own wood. He wrote to tell steamboatmen that he would be charging $5 for a cord of wood rather than the $4.50 they paid the previous year. And so he would write to the newspaper, even just to advertise his wood, continuously. This is some of his output over a 10-year period. So the Wolf Chief, like a lot of others, they learned that if you criticize your agent, if you criticize U.S. employees, if you criticize their practices, who they hire, if you criticize the interpreters or the farmers or the teachers, that you could perhaps weaken their hold on their people. If Wolf Chief criticizes the Fort Berthold agent, the Fort Berthold agent is weakened. His power is weakened. In many letters, Wolf Chief told, here's the letter to President Chester Arthur, and telling the president that his agent is bad, or he's saying that the agent is calling him bad because he's writing letters about the agent. My chief, he called the agent chief, says I'm bad because I write. I'm afraid. He's afraid of retribution from his chief because he's criticizing the chief, the agent in the letters. He's actually removed from the Indian police force, which was his job, because he was writing letters to higher ups. The agent fired him, and he was getting, payment. He was owed back pay. He claimed. So he says, he's afraid of the repercussions of these agents. Let's see. I'll start wrapping it up here. But again, let's see. One interesting, I'll end with this. One interesting thing he does, in the spring of 1882, he had really been fed up about the prices that were being charged to his people at the trader store. So white folks would set up shop with permission of the U.S. government on reservations to sell Indians stuff and make quite a bit of money. And of course, it wasn't uncommon practice for these Indian traders, these white folks, to jack up the prices, because if Native Americans don't shop at their store, they're going to have to travel a lot further away to the town, like Bismarck, to get cheaper prices. So in the spring of 82, Wolf Chief, wrote to wholesalers in Bismarck, to these white wholesalers, asking them how much their stuff cost. And of course, their stuff was cheaper. And he used that, as evidence that the Hidatsa and Mandans were being ripped off. He wrote to newspapers. He wrote to a newspaper in Virginia, which was widely read by so-called Friends of Indians. He wanted to broadcast that the traders at his reservation were crooked. He also, here's evidence of some of these letters. He also decided, after years of dealing with these white traders, he decided in 1889 to open his own store. He wanted to operate his own trader store on the reservation. There was this new trader that had come to town. The new trader was actually operating his store in the government storehouse on government property. And Wolf Chief in this letter is demonstrating that here with a drawing of where the trader's store is, actually in a government property. So Wolf Chief decided to start trading in his own house at his own expense. He didn't ask permission to do it. He sets up shop. But of course, the agent finds out, and he tries to stop it. So Wolf Chief says, you wanted us to be like white men. I'm trying to be like a white man. I'm trying to operate my own business. You need to help me to do that. I want you to help me be such. And so eventually, after quite a bit of effort, he finally, through this letter, he asked the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to please consider the matter, not in the interest of any white man, but in the interest of the Indians of this reservation. And so he's allowed eventually to operate his own store under conditions determined by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, but he operated the store for years. And 2 summers ago, on the reservation on Fort Berthold, there was a new store opened, and they named it after Wolf Chief. So there is a memory of this effort. So, what I really want to communicate is that through the use of correspondence, through the post office, hundreds of individuals, they were fighting against this massive colonial bureaucracy. And each one of those letters, even though it didn't seem like they were doing a lot, perhaps they weren't getting answered, they weren't making a lot of pushback. They were trying. And I believe that you compound all this effort over years. What would the history of the West, what would the history of Native American life, what would the history of the reservation era be if Native Americans weren't doing this, if they weren't being active, if they weren't pushing back? What would the U.S. government have been able to accomplish? So I'll end there, and I apologize if I went a little bit longer than planned.
No, that was
Thank you.
great. Thank you, Justin. And
Mhm.
Cameron, if you don't mind rejoining us, we'll hold our joint Q&A now. And I'll remind our audience, please, if you have questions for either speaker, please put your question into the Q&A box, and we will hopefully get those answered. We do have some questions, but since I'm in a position of privilege here, I'm going to ask some of my own questions first, as people are typing in their questions. And my first question is going back to you, Cameron. You mentioned that the letters between the siblings that traveling over 400 miles was some pretty rough terrain, but they made it like within 4 days, which sounds incredible to me, super impressive. And I'm wondering, do you know, based on the data that you found, I don't know if Justin, maybe you'll know this too, is like, how does that time frame compare to where people are in denser networks? Like, it looked like you didn't even have to go as far as New York, but like even Kansas would look like a pretty dense network. How quickly did the mail make it between writers?
I think the short answer is shockingly and surprisingly fast. And in some cases, almost like faster than we would expect today. And one of the really interesting parts for me about researching a book about the postal system is that it's actually difficult to find references to it, despite the fact that Americans were generating billions of pieces of mail every year. They, kind of like us today, tend to take it for granted because it was so ubiquitous and such a presence in their life, right? At no point does Benjamin Curtis ever mention the fact that, wow, isn't it remarkable that I can like walk outside my door and walk 15 minutes and there's a post office there? Despite the fact that it is, right? There's kind of reasons for that I didn't have time to get into in my talk. And so in a similar sense, I think oftentimes, perhaps not surprisingly, you will see people complaining if their letter is delayed or lost in transit, while never remarking on the fact that the vast majority of the letters they send end up not only arriving, but arriving in a very timely fashion. That does kind of depend on where you're living. And the way the network kind of operated was you had a system of trunk lines that operated along railroad lines. They were very, very quick, fast at moving mail between kind of major depots. And then branching off of those main railroad lines, mail would often travel in the form of, say, a stagecoach. And so you might get mail delivery twice a week if you were living in a very rural area, but then the mail would go into the back of a stagecoach, get transported to a rail line, and then end up, in this case, for instance, San Diego is the terminus for a railway line. And so that's one reason why I was able to get there so quickly.
How does, this is a quick follow-up to that question. How was it determined when a post office would be created? Because it seemed like Benjamin Curtis is in a pretty remote area. Like, how did they decide, oh, we're going to put a post office here?
Yeah, I was always looking for more of an answer here. And what I found really interesting was that what we would think of today as kind of the process of, establishing a new post office, a government entity, would be pretty bureaucratic, right? I'm guessing it would take quite a bit for a new building to open, for employees to get hired, all this other stuff. That's not at all how the post office operated in the 1800s. The way in which a new post office would get established is that a group living in an area would get together a petition, sign some signatures, send it into the federal government, usually to their representative, and saying, hey, we want mail here. And we've got this guy who owns a store and he's willing to hand out letters over the counter of his store. And the representative would then go to the post office department and say, hey, can you open up the post office here? And they'd say, sure. And the reason for this is because they weren't actually building anything new. They were grafting this kind of public service onto existing private infrastructure. So what they would do is they'd have that store owner, they'd pay them a very small commission to distribute and process mail. And then they'd contract with a local stagecoach company who might already be running kind of freights or goods or passengers in an area to throw a bag of mail in the back of the stagecoach and drop it off at that post office. So it's very minimal and lightweight infrastructure. And that's why I was able to expand really, really fast into these new areas. I didn't have a chance to kind of get into it, which is really interesting, but it was also able to contract and withdraw from those areas as well. So this very kind of unstable almost network, but that did give it the power to expand really rapidly.
Interesting. So even when you're pinpointing all these post offices, it's not necessarily that there may be like an individual standalone building, but they're housed within some other business or infrastructure there.
And in fact, it's almost never a standalone building unless you lived in a city. It would almost always be a hotel, a general store, even someone's house, a rancher just kind of, handing out letters to their neighbors kind of thing. It was a very, very different government institution than the one that exists today. Interesting.
One of the questions we have for you, Cameron, was about the Curtis siblings. If in the letters that you read between them, if they ever, and I imagine this maybe applies more to Benjamin, I'm not sure, if they ever wrote about the native local populations around them.
So they didn't really. Benjamin mentioned once in passing when he was living in Arizona that one of the local sheriffs had actually been killed while transporting prisoners to a nearby reservation. But the fact that he never mentioned it is actually really interesting in and of itself because I can just share my screen very briefly here.
Sure.
There we go. I pulled this up kind of during Justin's talk because I saw that question. He was living right here in Catalpa, right between these two post offices. This is about 15 miles from the border of a very large reservation for Apache people. And so despite the fact that he's like literally next door neighbors with this giant reservation, he never really talks about it. And that speaks to the kind of cordoned off nature of this government reservation system that Justin was talking about. And you can also see here a pretty common pattern where when Justin was talking about they're going to the local post office, spending time there, using that to try to send mail, censorship that's happening. Oftentimes that was happening either at a government agency. So there's a post office at almost every government Indian agency within a reservation, and the military presence, right? A fort oftentimes would be located within or very close to an Indian reservation. And that post office would largely be serving the kind of soldiers that were stationed there. But despite that proximity, you really don't see Benjamin Curtis talking about this kind of at all. So.
Okay. And there's a question that's kind of related to what you were just talking about of how did a post office look on a reservation? Was it in a government sponsored building, like you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, Justin, you can jump in here if you want to share, but I mean, I think it would oftentimes be in a government building that kind of housed both the official kind of government official as well, but also like the government storehouse or general store that they're using there too. But I'd be curious if you come across stuff in your work.
Yeah, so it's both. It's both the agency offices, the buildings that are government owned, and then those white trader stores. They also would operate the post office. Do you call them post offices and the trader store? They operated in those places. So the agency offices were typically in one or two places. Sometimes they'd have these sub agencies, and so that was hard for a lot of folks to travel to get their mail. And so they would have these other. Eventually, there's Native Americans I've found operating some of these trader stores. So yeah, definitely. Also, when did the Curtises move to Arizona? What year was it?
1885.
Yeah. I think one reason maybe there's not as much mention as letters because in the early 1880s there was tons of conflict Apaches resisting the reservation life, leaving all the time. And the government really cracked down on the Apaches in 1880, 1881. And of course, famously Geronimo for years, even 1886, I guess, right? I was resisting. So I think there was a huge focus on the Apaches in the early 1880s that really solidified that reservation boundary by 1885, I think.
Interesting. Okay. Justin, we have a couple of questions for you. One was if you've come across any letters between Western Native writers and Eastern Native populations.
Yeah, I just happened the past few weeks. One really like shocking letter. I think it comes from a Mohawk writer in the Mohawk language from, I think it's either upstate New York, but I think the town is across the border in Canada. It was sent to a pueblo in New Mexico in 1881. Like I really never expected to see that. I don't know why. I don't know what the letter says. It's not in a language I can read yet. But yeah, there are. But mostly it's Eastern folks who are at the Eastern schools who are writing back to their communities. There are, of course, Eastern Cherokees writing to Western Cherokees a lot, but my study doesn't focus on the Cherokees, the 5 tribes really at all. But yeah, it undoubtedly was occurring. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Finding that letter recently in the Mohawk language relates to this other question of the letters that you have uncovered. Were the majority of the letters written by Native Americans in their tribe's language, or did they write primarily in English? And also just asking in general, how literate was the Native American population?
Yeah, so mostly all in English. So in the 1880s, or so, most Native Americans didn't have a written language, at least Western tribes. There was a written Dakota language, Omaha, Ho-Chunk, Winnebago. This Siouan language family had because of the work of missionaries in earlier years, there had been this written language developed. Actually, the Ho-Chunks developed their own written language, I learned. And so there are a lot of letters in Dakota that I find, even letters written in Dakota to white folks. So yes, however, most other tribes were writing in English only. And of course, one benefit of writing in English was that it could be common language. A Kiowa could write to a Cheyenne or and they could understand each other. So yeah, literacy, it's tough to say. The statistics I use should be looked at with a grain of salt. The statistics come from the government. And of course, agents want to say, look what we're doing on the reservation. We have this many people reading now. But despite that, I still think there's use. And so I think that literacy rates rose quite rapidly in the 1880s. Now, I think about 18% of the folks that I studied, on dozens of reservations in the West were literate by 1889, I think, which is a lot of people. The population of Native Americans in the West, maybe 250,000. There's probably more than that, but that's according to the government. And so that's a lot of people. Now, despite that, it's still hard to find a lot of these letters because, it's, as Cameron knows, it's hard to find letters written by white people in the 1880s. And there's millions and millions of more white people. And so you try to find letters written amongst different groups, or even letters written to white folks. It's hard. So, but yeah, there's a lot of letters that I think that folks haven't really paid a lot of attention to.
When Native people were writing to each other from reservation to reservation, do you know how were they getting to the individual that they were trying to write to? Like, how were they bypassing the agents?
Well, I think most agents did not read the letters coming in. And of course, if they did, they wouldn't necessarily report it. But some do say that they're, especially in periods where there's supposed strife on the reservation, or even in the West, like during the ghost dance, undoubtedly agents are reading ghost dance letters for evidence of the ghost dance being spread. But a person, Northern Cheyenne, if they wanted to write a letter to a Southern Cheyenne, they would write the name of the person they're wanting to write to, write, the Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation in IT, and it would go there, right, Cameron? So that's how it and I think a lot of agents encourage letter writing because that's what white people did. They were a part of this continental network of corresponding and communicating. And so it was only discouraged if it was thought to be anti civilization, anti government.
It's fascinating.
So when Red Cloud was writing letters, agents didn't like that. But maybe a guy like American Horse, who was thought to be a little bit more friendly to U.S. plans, which he wasn't really necessarily. There's always those leaders that were thought to be using letters for bad reasons.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad we had this opportunity to bring your two topics together, Cameron and Justin, to really first help lay the groundwork to understand the larger network of the postal system and its expansion, but then also understand how different groups like Native Americans are then using it for their own advantage. So I really appreciate both of y'all joining us tonight. And I also want to thank our audience who's joining us live for joining us for our lecture. And I know that I learned a lot. I hope that maybe our audience did too. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.